In 1978, in a place called Litali in Tanzania, a paleoanthropologist named Mary Leakey discovered something that would change how we understand our origins. Preserved in volcanic ash that had hardened into stone over 3.6 million years, a trail of footprints crossed the ancient landscape testimony to beings who walked upright before language existed, before fire was mastered, before anything we would call human consciousness had awakened. The footprints were unmistakably bipedal, 2 legs, upright posture, walking as we walk, but the beings who made them were not human, were something older, something in between, something suspended in the long transformation from ape to whatever we are now. The trail stretches for nearly 30 meters, 2 individuals walking together, perhaps a third following in the footsteps of the first. The larger prints are about 21 centimeters long, the smaller perhaps 18 centimeters. A mother and child, some have suggested, partners traveling together, companions whose relationship we cannot know, whose names we cannot imagine, whose inner lives remain forever inaccessible. They walked across a landscape of volcanic ash freshly fallen from a nearby eruption, ash that was damp enough to preserve their tracks, that would harden and be buried and survive for millions of years, while everything else about their existence vanished. Bipedalism, walking upright on 2 legs, is the first great transformation in our lineage. It preceded large brains, preceded tool use, preceded everything else that we associate with being human. The earliest bipedal ancestors appear in the fossil record around 6 or 7 million years ago, though the evidence is fragmentary and the timing uncertain. Something happened in the forests of ancient Africa that made walking upright advantageous. Something changed that favored those who could stand and walk on 2 limbs rather than 4. The theories about why bipedalism evolved are numerous, and none is certain. Perhaps the forests were thinning, becoming savannas with tall grasses where seeing over obstacles required height. Perhaps freeing the hands allowed carrying food or infants more efficiently. Perhaps walking on 2 legs was more energy efficient for traveling long distances. Perhaps standing upright reduced exposure to the sun's heat. The theories multiply because the evidence is sparse. We cannot know what pressures shaped our ancestors, cannot reconstruct the ecological circumstances that made bipedalism beneficial. We can only observe the result: beings who walked upright before they thought complex thoughts. The Litali footprints were made by Australopithecus afarensis, the same species as the famous Lucy skeleton discovered in Ethiopia. These beings had small brains, roughly the size of chimpanzee brains. Their faces projected forward in ways that looked more ape than human. But they walked with a gait recognizably similar to our own. The arch of the foot, the position of the big toe, the pattern of weight transfer from heel to toe, all preserved in the hardened ash, all testifying to transformation that was already millions of years old when these particular footprints were made. What were they thinking, those beings who walked across the ash? Did they think at all in any sense we would recognize? Did they have preferences, fears, attachments to each other? The footprints cannot tell us. They reveal only movement, only the physical act of walking. The inner lives of our ancestors are forever closed to us, sealed behind the barrier of time that no evidence can breach. We can reconstruct their bodies from bones. We can infer their diets from teeth. But we cannot know what it felt like to be them, cannot access whatever awareness moved through their minds as they crossed that volcanic plain. The footprints were made in the rainy season. The ash was damp, soft enough to take impressions. Other prints crossed the same surface: rabbits, guinea fowl, elephants, rhinos, an entire ecosystem frozen in stone. The beings who would become human walked among creatures that still exist, though in different forms. They were part of an African landscape teeming with life, one species among many, distinguished only by their peculiar way of moving across the ground. They could not know that their footprints would survive, could not imagine that millions of years later their descendants would find those tracks and wonder. The preservation was accident. The volcanic eruption, the dampness of the ash, the quick burial by subsequent layers, all had to happen in the right sequence for the prints to survive. Countless other footprints were made across those millions of years by countless other individuals, and all of them vanished. Only these remained. Only these speak to us across the vast gulf of time. The accident of preservation became the gift of knowledge, fragmentary, limited, but infinitely precious. We know that our ancestors walked upright 3.6 million years ago because of footprints that should not have survived but did. We close this chapter contemplating those footprints, the ones that survived, and the countless others that did not. The walking that preceded everything human. The transformation that made possible all transformations that followed. When our ancestors rose to walk on two legs, they freed their hands to carry, to gesture, eventually to make tools and art and all the objects that human hands would create. The footprints at Litali are testimony to the beginning not of humanity as we know it, but of the possibility of humanity. The first steps on a journey that continues still. The footprints that walked before memory, forever preserved, forever mysterious. Forever the trace of ancestors whose walking made our existence possible, the footprints, the walking, the beginning that was not yet beginning but was preparing the way. Forever. Deep in the limestone caves of South Africa, in the sediments of East African rift valleys, in the ancient lake beds where water once gathered and life flourished, the bones rest. They have rested for millions of years, fragments of skulls and jawbones, teeth worn by foods we can only guess at, femurs that reveal how bodies moved through landscapes now vanished. The bones are all that remain of beings who lived and breathed and walked the earth. All else, their thoughts, their relationships, their experiences, is gone forever. But the bones whisper. They speak to those patient enough to listen, revealing secrets that words could never preserve. In 1924, a fossil skull arrived at the desk of Raymond Dart, an anatomist in Johannesburg. The skull had been blasted from limestone at a quarry called Tong, and it would change everything we thought we knew about human origins. The Tong child, as it came to be called, was the first Australopithecus ever recognized. Its brain was small, no larger than a chimpanzee's. But the position where the spinal cord entered the skull, the foramen magnum, was placed beneath the skull rather than behind it. This meant the head balanced atop an upright spine. This meant the Tong child walked on two legs. The finding was revolutionary. Our ancestors walked upright before their brains expanded. Bipedalism came first. Intelligence followed. The discovery was controversial. Scientists of the time expected human origins to be found in Asia, not Africa. They expected large brains to precede upright walking, not the reverse. Dart's claims were dismissed by many experts who could not accept that the cradle of humanity lay in Africa, that our ancestors were small-brained creatures rather than the intelligent beings they had imagined. It took decades for the scientific community to accept what the bones were saying. More discoveries followed, more Australopithecus specimens, more evidence that Africa was indeed where humanity began. The bones won the argument eventually. The bones always win. They are the evidence that outlasts opinion. In 1974, Donald Johanson found Lucy in the Afar region of Ethiopia, perhaps the most famous fossil in the world. Lucy was Australopithecus afarensis, the same species that made the Litali footprints. About 40% of her skeleton was preserved, extraordinary completeness for a fossil so old. She stood about 3.5 feet tall. She had a small brain. But her pelvis and leg bones showed unmistakably that she walked upright. Lucy lived about 3.2 million years ago. She died near a lake or stream. Her bones were found in sediments that once held water. How she died, we cannot know. But her bones survived, were fossilized, were buried for millions of years, and finally emerged to teach us about our distant past. The work of reading bones is patient and precise. Each fragment must be examined, measured, compared to other specimens. The shape of a tooth can reveal diet flat molars for grinding plants, sharp cusps for tearing meat. The thickness of leg bones can reveal body weight. The angle of joints can reveal posture and movement. The wear patterns on bones can reveal activity, whether an individual climbed trees frequently, whether they walked long distances, whether they suffered injuries or disease. Every bone is a text written in the language of biology, a text that scientists spend their lives learning to read. In 2013, cavers exploring the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa made a remarkable discovery. Deep in a chamber accessible only through a narrow chute, they found thousands of bones belonging to a previously unknown human species. The species was named Homo naledi, and it posed puzzles that remain unsolved. The individuals were relatively small-brained, with hands and feet that showed a mix of primitive and modern features. But most mysterious was their location. The chamber where they were found is extremely difficult to reach. How did so many bodies end up there? Were they placed deliberately? Did Homo naledi practice some form of burial, some care for the dead? The bones suggest possibilities that challenge our assumptions about what makes us human. The fossil record is incomplete by nature. Bones rarely fossilize, they usually decay, are eaten by scavengers, are scattered and destroyed. The fossils we find are the exceptions, the lucky few preserved by accidents of geology and chemistry. For every individual whose bones survive, thousands, perhaps millions, lived and died, leaving no trace. The ancestors we study are not representative samples, but survivors of a brutal filtering process. We must remember this when we try to understand our past. The bones we have are precious precisely because they are rare. Each fossil is a window into a world we can barely imagine, a world populated by beings whose lives were rich and complex, but whose testimony is limited to fragments of calcium and phosphorus. The bones reveal not just individual specimens, but patterns of evolution, the gradual transformation from one form to another across millions of years. Brain size increased over time, though not smoothly or consistently. Body proportions changed. Faces became flatter, teeth became smaller, hands became more dexterous. The changes were not driven by any plan or purpose. Evolution has no goal. They were shaped by circumstances we cannot fully reconstruct, by pressures and opportunities that favored some variants over others. The bones are the record of this transformation. They show us what happened, even when they cannot tell us why. We close this chapter in the quiet of a museum laboratory where fossil bones rest in carefully labeled drawers, where scientists spend their lives trying to hear what the bones are saying. The whispers are faint. The messages are fragmentary. But they are all we have, the only testimony to millions of years of human becoming. The bones that whisper across millennia. The fragments that survived when everything else was lost. The evidence that speaks in silence, in shape, in the material residue of lives lived long before memory. The bones, forever preserved, forever patient, forever waiting for those who will listen. The bones that whisper, forever. Africa is where we began. Not metaphorically, but literally, every human alive today traces ancestry back to African populations, to valleys and savannas and lake shores where our species emerged and developed and eventually dispersed across the earth. For most of human history, this was not known. For centuries, scientists looked elsewhere, to Asia, to Europe, for human origins. The idea that humanity began in Africa was slow to gain acceptance, resisted by prejudices and assumptions that shaped scientific thought. But the evidence was relentless. The fossils kept emerging from African soil. The genetic studies kept pointing backward to African ancestors. Africa is the cradle. Africa is where everything human began. The Great Rift Valley stretches thousands of kilometers through eastern Africa, a geological feature created by tectonic forces pulling the continent apart. The rifting created highlands and lowlands, lakes and rivers, diverse environments where different species could evolve. The rifting also exposed ancient sediments, bringing fossils to the surface where they could be discovered. The Rift Valley is not just where our ancestors lived, it is where their remains were preserved and where we have found them. The geology that shaped our evolution also preserved the evidence of that evolution. The valley was cradle and archive both. Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania is one of the most important sites in human origins research. Louis and Mary Leakey spent decades there, finding fossils and stone tools that revolutionized our understanding. The gorge cuts through layers of sediment laid down over nearly 2 million years, a geological library of human evolution. Different species appear at different levels: early Homo, Paranthropus, and the tools they made or did not make. The stratigraphy, the layering of sediments, provides a timeline. Deeper means older. The gorge tells the story of human evolution in Africa, chapter by chapter, layer by layer. Ethiopia's Afar region is another crucial site, the place where Lucy was found, where some of the oldest stone tools have been discovered, where our genus Homo may have first emerged. The landscape is harsh, now hot, dry, forbidding. But it was different in the past. Lakes filled the basins. Rivers flowed through valleys. Forests and woodlands provided food and shelter. Our ancestors lived in a landscape that no longer exists, a landscape we can only reconstruct from sediments and fossils and pollen preserved in ancient lake beds. The Afar tells us that Africa has changed, that the continent our ancestors knew was not the continent we see today. South Africa's caves have yielded treasures as well, the Tong child, Australopithecus africanus specimens, the mysterious Homo naledi. The caves preserved bones differently than the open-air sites of East Africa. Bodies fell or were dragged into underground chambers, were covered by sediments washing in, were mineralized by the calcium-rich water dripping through limestone. The caves are time capsules, holding remains that surface sites would have destroyed. Each cave system is a puzzle. How did the bones get there? What happened to the individuals who died in those dark places? The answers are not always clear, but the questions draw researchers back again and again. The diversity of our African ancestors was greater than we once imagined. It was not a single line of descent, one species replacing another in orderly succession. It was a bush, a tangle of branches, multiple species coexisting and eventually going extinct until only one remained, us. The Australopithecines diversified into multiple forms. Early Homo split into branches that would include Homo erectus, Homo habilis, and others whose relationships remain debated. Our family tree is not a tree at all but a dense thicket, and Africa is where that thicket grew. The climate of Africa fluctuated dramatically over the millions of years of human evolution. Ice ages in the northern hemisphere affected global weather patterns. African climates oscillated between wet and dry, between periods when forests expanded and periods when savannas dominated. These fluctuations may have driven evolution, forcing adaptations to changing conditions, isolating populations that would evolve independently, opening corridors that allowed migration and mixing. Our ancestors were shaped by a changing world, a world that was never stable, that demanded flexibility and adaptation. The Africa that made us was not one environment but many, shifting across time. Every human alive today is African. The genetic evidence is clear. The diversity of human populations outside Africa is a subset of the diversity within Africa. The migrations that populated the world came from African source populations. The features we use to distinguish human groups' skin color, hair texture, facial features are recent adaptations to different environments, thin veneers over the deep African heritage we all share. Whatever divides us is shallow. Whatever separates us is recent. The African roots we share go back millions of years. We are all children of the cradle. We close this chapter looking out across the African landscape at sunset, the same sun that set on our ancestors millions of years ago, the same sky that arched over their brief lives. The cradle that rocked in African valleys still holds the bones of those who came before. The soil still guards their secrets. The questions remain and the research continues, but the fundamental truth is established. Africa is home. Africa is origin. Africa is where the human story began, where it developed across millions of years, where it finally produced the species that would spread across the earth but would never cease being African at its deepest roots. The cradle, the valleys, the homeland we carry within us, forever African, forever connected to the soil that made us, forever. Before language, before art, before fire was mastered, our ancestors learned to shape stone. The oldest known stone tools, crude choppers and flakes found at a site called Lomkwi in Kenya, date to 3.3 million years ago. This is earlier than we once thought possible, earlier than the emergence of our genus Homo. The beings who made these tools were likely Australopithecines, or something related creatures with small brains who nevertheless looked at stones and saw possibility, who understood that striking rock against rock could produce something useful. The shaping of stone was the first great technological revolution, and it began long before humanity as we know it existed. The Alduin tradition, named for Olduvai Gorge, where it was first recognized, represents the next stage. Beginning around 2.6 million years ago, Alduin tools show more consistent patterns, more evidence of planning and technique. Simple choppers made by striking flakes from a core, sharp flakes that could cut through hide and meat. The tools were crude by later standards but effective for their purpose. They allowed access to foods that would otherwise be unavailable: meat from carcasses, marrow from bones, tubers from the ground. The tools expanded what our ancestors could eat and where they could live. The tools made new ways of being possible. Making stone tools is not simple. It requires understanding of raw materials which stones will fracture predictably, which will shatter uselessly. It requires understanding of physics, how the angle and force of a blow affects the resulting fracture. It requires planning, envisioning the finished tool before the first strike, mapping out the sequence of blows that will produce the desired shape. Studies of modern humans learning to make stone tools show that it takes years to develop real proficiency, that the skills are not intuitive but must be learned. Our ancestors must have taught each other, must have passed knowledge across generations. Tool making implies learning, implies culture, implies something beyond mere instinct. The Acheulean tradition emerged around 1.7 million years ago, a new approach to stone tool manufacture that would persist for over 1 million years. The signature artifact is the hand axe, a teardrop-shaped tool worked on both sides, symmetrical, elegant in a way that Alduin tools were not. Hand axes required more sophisticated techniques, more planning, more skill. They were made by Homo erectus and their relatives, beings with larger brains and more complex behaviors than their predecessors. The hand axes spread across Africa and into Asia and Europe, carried by populations expanding into new territories. The tools were versatile, used for butchering, digging, scraping, perhaps for purposes we cannot guess. Why were the hand axes so consistent in form? Across hundreds of thousands of years and thousands of miles, the basic shape remained remarkably similar. Was there something optimal about the design, something functional that made that particular form the best solution? Or was there something cultural, a tradition passed down so faithfully that the form persisted even when other aspects of life changed? The hand axes raise questions about what our ancestors valued, about aesthetic preferences that may have existed before language could name them. The symmetry of the hand axes suggests minds that appreciated balance, that found something satisfying in proportion and form. Later stone tool traditions showed increasing sophistication. The Levallois technique, which emerged around 300,000 years ago, involved preparing a stone core in a specific way before striking off a predetermined flake. The technique required envisioning the final product before the work began, planning a complex sequence of steps, executing the plan precisely. The cognitive demands were significant. The beings who used Levallois technology, including Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, had minds capable of abstraction, of imagining what did not yet exist and making it real through skilled action. The relationship between tool-making and brain evolution is debated, but likely significant. Did larger brains enable more sophisticated tools? Or did the demands of tool-making select for larger brains? Perhaps both a feedback loop where tools and minds drove each other's development. The hands that shaped stone were connected to brains that were shaped by the shaping. The tools were not just products of intelligence but producers of it. The stones taught hands to think, and thinking hands demanded more capable brains. The tools also tell us about our ancestors' lives in ways that bones cannot. Where we find tools, we know our ancestors lived and worked. The raw materials they used reveal their knowledge of the landscape. They knew where to find good stone, sometimes traveling significant distances to obtain it. The worn edges of tools reveal how they were used cutting, scraping, chopping, pounding. The distribution of tools across a site reveals how space was organized, where different activities occurred. Stone tools are windows into daily life, into the ordinary activities of beings who left no written records but left their tools behind. We close this chapter holding an imaginary stone, feeling its weight, its texture, its potential. Somewhere deep in our past, an ancestor held a similar stone and saw what it could become, struck it against another stone, and watched the flakes fall away, created something that had not existed before. That moment, repeated countless times across millions of years, was the beginning of technology, the beginning of human power to reshape the world. The stones that taught hands to think, the tools that made us as much as we made them, the shaping that continues still though the materials have changed. We are tool makers by nature, inheritors of skills that go back millions of years. The stones, the tools, the shaping, forever defining what it means to be human. Forever. Fire was not discovered in a single moment of enlightenment. It was not a gift from gods or a sudden inspiration of genius. Fire was mastered gradually, across hundreds of thousands of years, through a process we can only partially reconstruct. Our ancestors first encountered fire as a natural force. Lightning strikes igniting grasslands, volcanic eruptions spewing flame, the burning that swept across landscapes and transformed them. Fire was terror and wonder, destruction and opportunity. Somewhere in the deep past, our ancestors learned not just to survive fire but to use it, to capture it, to keep it burning when nature would have let it die. This was transformation. This was power. This was the beginning of something new. The evidence for early fire use is debated and uncertain. Some researchers see signs of controlled fire at sites over 1 million years old, charred bones and sediments at Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, burned areas at sites in Kenya and Israel. Others are skeptical, arguing that the evidence could be explained by natural fires rather than human control. The problem is distinguishing intentional hearths from accidental burning, controlled fire from wildfire that happened to pass through a site where our ancestors lived. The evidence is ambiguous, and the timing of fire's domestication remains one of the great unsolved questions of human origins. By 400,000 years ago, the evidence becomes clearer. At sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, we find hearths concentrations of ash and charcoal in locations that suggest repeated, intentional burning. The fires were made in the same places again and again. They were associated with human artifacts and bones. They were used for cooking. Burned animal bones show signs of heating, the kind of damage that comes from roasting meat over flame. By this time, multiple human species were using fire regularly. Homo erectus, early Neanderthals, perhaps others, all had mastered this elemental force. Cooking transformed our biology. Raw meat and plants are difficult to digest, requiring large guts and long processing times. Cooking breaks down fibers and proteins, making nutrients more accessible, allowing smaller digestive systems and shorter feeding periods. The energy saved by easier digestion could fuel larger brains. The time saved from chewing, which other primates spend hours doing each day, could be devoted to other activities. Some researchers argue that cooking was essential to the brain expansion that marks human evolution, that we could not have developed our distinctive intelligence without the predigestion that fire provides. Fire extended the day. For millions of years, our ancestors had been creatures of light, active during daylight hours, sleeping or hiding through the darkness. Fire changed this. Fire pushed back the night, created warm, lit spaces where activity could continue after sunset. The fire's light allowed work to be done, tools to be made, food to be prepared that would otherwise wait for morning. The fire's warmth made cold nights bearable, allowed ancestors to survive in climates that would otherwise be hostile. Fire expanded where humans could live and what they could do there. The social effects of fire may have been as important as the biological ones. Fire created gathering places, created circles of warmth and light where groups could come together, where social bonds could strengthen, where knowledge could be shared. The firelit hours after dark were different from the busy daylight hours of fugiting. They were times for talking, for teaching, for the telling of stories that would eventually become culture. Fire may have been the catalyst that transformed our ancestors from bands of cooperating individuals into societies held together by shared knowledge and belief. Fire was also protection. The predators that threatened our ancestors, the big cats, the hyenas, the wild dogs feared fire. A circle of flame created a safe zone where sleep could come without constant vigilance. The fire stood guard while humans rested. This protection may have been crucial to the success of our lineage, allowing restful sleep that other primates could not achieve, supporting the brain development that requires deep rest for consolidation of learning. Fire was guardian as well as tool, protector as well as provider. The making of fire, not just the keeping of captured flame, but the creation of fire from nothing, came later. We do not know when exactly. Friction methods, rubbing sticks together, drilling into, would leave little archaeological trace. Percussion methods, striking flint against pyrite to create sparks, may preserve longer, but the evidence is still rare. By the time of Homo sapiens, fire-making was certainly mastered. Our species could create flame when needed, was no longer dependent on capturing fire from natural sources. The knowledge spread through teaching, passed down across generations, became part of what it meant to be human. We close this chapter beside an imaginary fire, feeling its warmth on our faces, watching its light flicker and dance, hearing its soft crackle in the darkness. The fire we sit beside is the same fire our ancestors sat beside hundreds of thousands of years ago. The same warmth, the same light, the same primal comfort that reaches something deep within us, something that remembers what fire meant to beings for whom darkness was danger and cold was death. The fire that changed what it meant to be alive. The mastery that made us who we are. The flame that still burns in hearths and furnaces, in the warm blood that marks us as fire's children. The fire, forever burning, forever transforming, forever the center around which human life has gathered. Forever. For millions of years our ancestors wandered. Not aimlessly, they followed patterns written in the seasons, in the movements of game, in the ripening of fruits and the availability of water. They knew their landscapes intimately, knew where to find food in each season, knew the paths that connected water sources, knew the shelters that would protect them from storms. But they did not stay. They moved. Movement was their way of being, their relationship with the world. Home was not a fixed point but a territory. A range of familiar places visited and revisited in cycles that matched the Earth's own rhythms. The earliest dispersals from Africa are lost in time's shadows. Homo erectus was certainly a wanderer. Fossils from this species have been found across Africa, Asia, and Europe. Some of these migrations happened nearly 2 million years ago, when small-brained but resourceful beings walked out of Africa and into new worlds. They carried their stone tools with them, carried their knowledge of fire, carried the social bonds that allowed small groups to survive in unfamiliar landscapes. They did not know they were colonizing new continents. They simply walked, following opportunities, following game, following whatever drew them forward into territories no human had ever seen. The routes out of Africa were limited by geography. The Sahara was sometimes barrier and sometimes corridor, depending on climate cycles that made it desert or savanna. The Horn of Africa offered a short crossing to the Arabian Peninsula when sea levels were low. The Levant, the region now divided among Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, was a land bridge between continents, a crossroads where populations mixed and mingled. These corridors opened and closed as climates shifted, creating windows of opportunity that some populations seized and others missed. The dispersals were not single events but repeated waves, each generation moving a little further, each expansion building on what came before. Java man was found in Indonesia, Homo erectus at the far edge of the Asian continent, reached perhaps 1 million years ago by populations that had traveled from Africa through southern Asia. Peking man was found in China, another Homo erectus population that had made its way across the vast distances of eastern Asia. These discoveries, made in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, revealed the scope of human dispersal, the remarkable distances that our ancestors traveled on foot, generation after generation, continent after continent. The wandering was not local but global, not limited but expansive. Europe was reached later. The climate was harsh, the ice ages severe, the challenges significant. But by 800,000 years ago or earlier, human species had entered Europe, adapting to cold climates that differed radically from the African environments where they had evolved. The adaptations required were substantial new ways of finding food, new strategies for surviving cold, new technologies for dealing with ice and snow. The populations that succeeded in Europe were changed by the experience, became something different from their African cousins, evolved in ways that would eventually produce the Neanderthals and other European populations. The wandering was not mere movement but transformation. Each new environment posed new challenges. Each new landscape required new solutions. The populations that dispersed were changed by their dispersal, adapted to local conditions, developed variations that distinguished them from relatives who had stayed behind or who had gone different directions. The human family tree spread across the earth, and its branches evolved independently, producing the diversity of human species that once existed. The wandering created divergence. The separation created difference. The different species that would later coexist and sometimes interbreed were products of wandering, of the distances that accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years. The final great dispersal was that of Homo sapiens, our own species, emerging from Africa perhaps 300,000 years ago, beginning to spread beyond Africa around 100,000 years ago, reaching every habitable continent within the last 60,000 years. This dispersal was faster than earlier ones, more complete, more devastating to the species that had spread before us. Within tens of thousands of years, a blink in evolutionary time, Homo sapiens had reached Australia, had entered the Americas, had populated islands in the Pacific. We were the ultimate wanderers, the species that would eventually fill every ecological niche that humans could occupy. What drove the wandering? What made populations leave familiar territories for unknown horizons? Population pressure. Perhaps success leading to expansion as territories became crowded. Climate change forcing movement as old territories became uninhabitable. Simple curiosity, the same drive that makes us explore still, the desire to know what lies beyond the next hill, beyond the horizon, beyond everything we know. The wanderers carried their homes within themselves, carried the knowledge and skills and social bonds that made survival possible. Home was not a place but a way of being, not a location but a capacity to make any location home. We close this chapter looking outward from Africa, across the landscapes our ancestors crossed, the deserts and mountains, the rivers and coasts, the vast distances covered by feet that walked for millions of years, the wanderers who carried home within themselves, the beings who were never truly lost because they knew how to find food and water, how to make fire and shelter, how to survive wherever they went. We are their descendants. We carry their restlessness, their curiosity, their willingness to move into the unknown. The wandering continues still in exploration and migration, in the restlessness that will not let us stay. The wanderers, forever walking, forever carrying home within, forever. We were not alone. For most of human history, other human species shared the Earth, cousins rather than ancestors, parallel experiments in becoming human. They had their own cultures, their own tools, their own ways of being human that were different from ours. They lived in Europe and Asia while our ancestors were still developing in Africa. They survived ice ages and climate shifts, adapted to environments that would challenge any species. And then they vanished, all of them. We are alone now, the only surviving human species, and we cannot be certain why. The Neanderthals are our best known relatives, close enough to be recognized as cousins, different enough to be named as a separate species. They evolved in Europe during ice ages, developing bodies suited to cold climates, stocky and muscular, with large noses that may have warmed frigid air. Their brains were as large as ours, sometimes larger. They made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, buried their dead with what may have been ritual care. They survived for hundreds of thousands of years in conditions that would seem impossibly harsh. They were successful by any measure except the last one. They are gone, and we remain. The encounters between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are written in our DNA. Between 1 and 4% of the genome of non-African humans comes from Neanderthals' testimony to meetings that produced children, to coexistence that lasted long enough for genetic mixing to occur. The meetings were not rare encounters, but sustained interactions, populations living near each other for thousands of years. Some of those interactions produced offspring. Some of those offspring survived to pass their Neanderthal genes to us. We carry the Neanderthals within us. They did not entirely vanish. Something of them lives on in our cells. The Denisovans are even more mysterious, known primarily from DNA extracted from finger bones and teeth found in a Siberian cave. The DNA reveals that they were distinct from both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, a separate branch of the human family tree. They too interbred with our ancestors. Denisovan DNA is found in modern populations across Asia, and particularly in Melanesia and Australia. The encounters must have occurred in Asia, as Homo sapiens spread through that continent and met the populations already living there. The Denisovans are ghosts in our genome, relatives we know almost entirely through the genetic traces they left in us. Homo erectus survived longer than any other human species, nearly 2 million years, from Africa to Java, from the earliest controlled use of fire to times when modern humans were spreading across the world. They were not our ancestors, they were a separate lineage that evolved in parallel, that developed their own tools and behaviors, that spread across the old world long before we existed. Some erectus populations survived until remarkably recently, perhaps 100,000 years ago in Java, which means they would have encountered early Homo sapiens. What those encounters were like, we cannot know. The erectus left no written records, no art that we can interpret, nothing but bones and tools to testify to their long existence. Homo floresiensis, The hobbits of Indonesia survived until perhaps 50,000 years ago on the island of Flores. They were small adults, stood about 3.5 feet tall, with brains the size of chimpanzees. Yet they made stone tools, hunted small elephants, controlled fire. The small size may have been adaptation to island living, where resources are limited and smaller bodies are advantageous. The small brains challenge our assumptions about the relationship between brain size and intelligence. How could such small-brained beings make tools and hunt effectively? The questions remain unanswered, as mysterious as the beings who raised them. Why did they disappear? Why did Neanderthals and Denisovans and all the others vanish while we survived? The answers are uncertain and probably multiple. Climate change may have played a role. The ice ages posed challenges that some populations could not meet. Competition with expanding Homo sapiens populations may have been factor. We may have outcompeted our relatives for resources, displaced them from territories they had occupied for millennia. Disease may have contributed. Homo sapiens arriving from Africa may have carried pathogens to which other human species had no immunity. We may have killed them directly in conflicts over territory or resources. The extinction of our relatives is not solved mystery but open question. The possibility that we caused their extinction is troubling. It suggests something dark about our nature, something that reaches beyond competition to something more deliberate. But we cannot know. The evidence does not distinguish between passive replacement and active destruction. We can only observe the result. Where once there were many human species, now there is only one. The diversity that characterized human evolution for millions of years was reduced to a single form: us. Whatever the cause, the consequence is clear. We are alone. We are the only humans left. We close this chapter in the silence where other human voices should be. The companions who walked beside us and vanished. The relatives whose faces we cannot see, whose thoughts we cannot know, whose worlds we cannot visit. They were human in ways different from our humanity, experiments in being human that did not survive, branches of the family tree that were cut short. We carry their DNA. We inherit their world. We bear whatever responsibility accompanies our survival. The companions who vanished, the silence where they should be, the loneliness of being the only human species that remains, forever alone, forever wondering, forever carrying the traces of those who walked beside us and are gone, forever. Consciousness is the greatest mystery. Not the universe with its billions of galaxies, not the quantum realm with its strange behavior, not the origins of life itself, but consciousness. The simple fact that there is something it is like to be you, that experience exists, that matter organized in certain ways produces awareness. Somewhere in our evolutionary history, minds emerged. Beings began to experience the world rather than merely respond to it. The universe began to know itself through organisms that could ask what the universe was. This is the mystery we carry within us, the mystery that we are. The emergence of consciousness cannot be dated because consciousness leaves no fossils. We cannot know when our ancestors first experienced the world in ways we would recognize, when they first had thoughts that resembled our thoughts, when they first looked at the night sky and wondered. The evidence we have is indirect, the artifacts that imply mental capabilities, the behaviors that suggest awareness, the complexity that requires explanation. From stone tools and burial practices, from art and symbols, from the patterns of behavior preserved in archaeological sites, we infer the minds that produced them. But inference is not observation. The inner lives of our ancestors remain hidden behind time's impenetrable veil. What distinguishes human minds from other minds? Many animals are conscious. They experience pain and pleasure, fear and satisfaction. But human consciousness includes capacities that seem unique or at least more developed. We can think about thinking, can reflect on our own mental states, can examine our own beliefs, can wonder about our wondering. We can imagine what does not exist, can conceive of possibilities, can create fiction, can envision futures that may never come. We can remember the past not just as automatic response but as deliberate recollection, can revisit experiences in memory, can learn from what happened long ago. These capacities, metacognition, imagination, episodic memory, define human consciousness and distinguish it from whatever consciousness other animals possess. The brain expanded dramatically during human evolution. From the small brains of Australopithecines, perhaps 400 cubic centimeters, to the large brains of modern humans averaging about 1,400 cubic centimeters, brain size increased more than threefold. The increase was not steady, it happened in spurts and plateaus, driven by selective pressures we cannot fully identify. Larger brains are expensive. They consume enormous amounts of energy, require extended periods of development, pose challenges for childbirth. The fact that large brains evolved despite these costs suggests that the benefits were substantial. But what were the benefits? What did larger brains allow that smaller brains could not achieve? The questions remain partially unanswered. Social complexity may have driven brain evolution. Humans live in groups, and group living requires sophisticated social cognition, keeping track of relationships, predicting behavior, cooperating and competing with others. The social brain hypothesis suggests that the challenges of group living selected for larger brains capable of managing complex social information. Gossip, alliance building, status competition, empathy, deception, all the intricate dynamics of human social life require mental capabilities that simpler brains could not support. Our large brains may be primarily social organs, evolved to navigate the complexities of living with others. But social complexity alone cannot explain everything. Human minds also mastered the physical world in ways that other primate minds did not. Tool-making required understanding of cause and effect, of materials and their properties, of techniques that had to be learned and transmitted. Fire use required understanding of combustion, of fuel, of the relationship between action and outcome. Hunting large animals required planning, coordination, prediction of prey behavior. The minds that evolved to handle social complexity were also minds that could understand and manipulate the physical world, that could create technology, that could shape the environment to human purposes. The emergence of symbolic thought was a crucial threshold. At some point, human minds became capable of using symbols, of letting one thing stand for another, of creating representations that could be shared and manipulated. Language is the most important symbolic system, but not the only one. Art is symbolic. The painted horse on a cave wall stands for horses in general, represents something beyond its own existence. Ritual is symbolic actions that mean more than they literally accomplish. Number is symbolic, abstract quantities that can be applied to any collection. The symbolic capacity transformed human cognition, allowed the creation of shared meaning, enabled culture in the full sense of accumulated knowledge passed between generations. The minds that emerged from evolution could do something unprecedented. They could remember what had not happened, could imagine scenarios, possibilities, fictions, could create stories about people who never existed, events that never occurred, futures that might or might not come to pass. This capacity, imagination, is the foundation of planning, of art, of science, of everything that makes human minds distinctive. We are the animals that imagine, that create possibilities in our minds before we create them in the world. The minds that learn to remember what had not happened. The consciousness that dreams. The awareness that wonders at its own existence. We close this chapter in the mystery of our own minds, the awareness that reads these words, and ponders its own existence. The minds that learned to remember what had not happened, the consciousness that emerged from matter and now contemplates matter. How did neurons firing become the experience of being? How did chemistry become feeling? How did the blind processes of evolution produce beings that could ask such questions? The mystery remains. The questions deepen. The minds that learned to imagine carry within them questions they cannot answer. The emergence of consciousness. The awakening that continues still. The mystery at the heart of what we are, forever wondering, forever aware, forever unable to fully explain awareness itself, forever. Deep in caves where no natural light penetrated, our ancestors created art. The painted caves of Europe, Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira hold images that still astonish. Animals depicted with skill and life, and what can only be called artistic vision, made by people carrying flickering torches into absolute darkness to paint on surfaces no one else might ever see. The caves were not living spaces. They were something else, sacred sites, perhaps, places where meaning was made and stored, where human creativity first expressed itself in forms that have survived the grinding passage of time. Chauvet Cave in France holds the oldest known cave paintings, over 30,000 years old, from a time when Neanderthals still lived in parts of Europe, when ice ages had covered much of the northern world in glaciers. The paintings are not primitive experiments but sophisticated works, lions rendered with anatomical accuracy and artistic power, horses shown in motion, rhinoceroses depicted with careful attention to their distinctive forms. The skill suggests traditions already long established, techniques developed over many generations before these particular images were made. Art at Chauvet did not spring suddenly into existence. It was the product of a long development that we cannot trace. Lascaux was discovered in 1940 by teenagers exploring a hole in the ground. What they found took their breath away: a vast underground gallery covered with paintings, hundreds of animals rendered in natural pigments on the stone walls. The cave has been called the Sistine Chapel of Prehistory, and the comparison is not hyperbole. The artists who worked at Lascaux understood perspective, understood how to create the illusion of movement, understood how to use the natural contours of the cave walls to enhance their images. Bulls seem to charge from the walls. Horses run in groups. The art is alive in ways that challenge our assumptions about primitive peoples. Why did they paint in darkness? The caves were not convenient places to make art. They were difficult to access, dangerous to navigate, uncomfortable to work in. The artists had to carry their materials deep underground, had to paint by the light of flickering lamps or torches, had to work in positions that must have been physically demanding. The effort suggests that the location mattered, that the caves were chosen deliberately, that the darkness was part of the meaning. Some researchers suggest that the caves were portals to another world, that the animals painted on walls were beings summoned from realms beyond ordinary experience. The darkness was not obstacle but purpose. The handprints found in many caves are among the most moving images our ancestors left. Hands pressed against stone, pigment blown around them, leaving silhouettes that have survived for tens of thousands of years. The hands say something simple and profound. I was here. I existed. I made this mark. The hands are specific to individuals. Some researchers have identified repeated hand prints, the same person leaving marks in multiple locations. The hands are connection across time, reaching toward us from a past we can barely imagine, asking to be seen, to be remembered, to be acknowledged as real. But cave art was not the only form. Portable art, carved figurines, decorated objects appears in the archaeological record around the same time or perhaps earlier. The Venus figurines, female forms carved from ivory and stone, are among the most famous portable art objects. Their meaning is debated. Fertility symbols, goddess representations, self-portraits, toys. The debates cannot be resolved because the makers left no explanation. The objects simply exist, testimony to minds that found meaning in representation, that created images of the human form, that expressed something through carving that we can see but cannot fully understand. The emergence of art marks a threshold in human cognitive evolution. Art requires abstraction, the ability to let one thing represent another. Art requires planning the conception of an image before its execution. Art requires technique skills that must be learned and practiced. Art requires meaning, something beyond mere mark-making, something that gives the activity purpose. The minds that created art were minds that could symbolize, that could communicate through images, that could create lasting objects that preserved meaning across time. Art was not decoration. Art was transformation of human consciousness, the emergence of capacities that would eventually produce all the cultural achievements that followed. The art continues to speak. Thousands of years after the last painter left the caves, we enter with our flashlights and cameras and find that the images still have power, still move us, still connect us to beings whose lives we cannot know but whose creativity we recognize. The art that bloomed in darkness speaks across time because it speaks to something fundamental in human nature: the need to create, to express, to leave marks that outlast us. The ancient artists are long dead, their names unknown, their lives invisible, but their art remains. Their hands still reach toward us from the walls. Their animals still run through the darkness, waiting for the light that will reveal them. We close this chapter in the imagined darkness of an ancient cave, where a torch flickers against painted walls, where animals seem to move in the dancing light, where the silence holds something sacred. The art that bloomed in darkness, the creativity that emerged in our ancestors and has never stopped. The images that have survived the millennia and still speak, still move us, still connect us to those who came before. The first art, the lasting art. The art that defines us as beings who make meaning, who create beauty, who reach beyond ourselves toward something that might outlast us. The art, forever preserved, forever powerful, forever testimony to what human minds can create, forever. The earliest burials reveal something profound about the minds that performed them, that our ancestors began to care for the dead, to treat death as transition rather than ending, to believe or hope that existence continued beyond the body's failure. The deliberate burial of the dead is not mere disposal of a corpse. It is statement, is ritual, is treatment of the body that implies beliefs about what death means. When we find ancient burials, bodies positioned deliberately, surrounded by objects, covered with care, we find evidence of minds grappling with mortality, of beings who knew that death would come and tried to make meaning of what they knew. The Neanderthals buried their dead. This was once controversial, but the evidence has accumulated. At sites like La Pharisee in France, multiple Neanderthal bodies were found in positions that suggest deliberate placement rather than accidental burial. Some were in fetal positions, perhaps suggesting beliefs about death as return, as new beginning. Some were associated with grave goods, stone tools placed with the dead, perhaps for use in whatever existence followed. The Neanderthal burials are not as elaborate as later human burials, but they are unmistakable. Our relatives cared for their dead thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. The famous flower burial at Shanidar Cave in Iraq has been debated for decades. The discovery suggested that Neanderthals had placed flowers with their dead pollen from various species, was found concentrated around the body. Critics argued that the pollen could have been deposited by animals or natural processes. The debate continues, unresolved. But even without the flowers, the burials at Shanidar reveal careful treatment of the dead bodies, placed in positions that cannot be accidental, remains that were protected from scavengers and preserved for us to find. Whatever beliefs the Neanderthals held, they expressed those beliefs through treatment of the dead that went beyond practical necessity. Homo sapiens burials became increasingly elaborate over time. At Sungir in Russia, dating to about 34,000 years ago, archaeologists found burials of extraordinary richness. Bodies were covered with thousands of mammoth ivory beads estimated to represent thousands of hours of labor. Bracelets of ivory adorned the arms. Spears and other tools accompanied the dead. The effort invested in these burials is remarkable. The beads alone would have taken years to make. The burials speak of belief systems we cannot access, of afterlife conceptions we cannot know, of importance attached to death that justified enormous expenditure of time and resources. The use of ochre red iron oxide pigment in burials is widespread and ancient. Bodies were often covered with ochre, painted red, surrounded by the color of blood. The symbolism seems clear even if its specific meaning is lost. Red as blood, as life, as the vital force that leaves the body at death. The ochre may have been an attempt to restore vitality, to maintain connection between dead and living, to mark the boundary between life and death in visible color. The widespread use of ochre across different cultures and time periods suggests something fundamental in human response to death, something that our ancestors shared across enormous distances and thousands of years. Death awareness is uniquely human burden. Other animals may grieve. Elephants seem to mourn their dead. Chimpanzees may sit with deceased companions, but only humans know that they will die. Only humans can anticipate their own mortality, can imagine the moment of their dying, can create elaborate systems of belief to manage the terror that this knowledge produces. The burials are responses to this awareness. They are attempts to make death meaningful, to refuse the finality that biology imposes, to insist that something continues beyond the body's ending. The beliefs behind the burials may vary infinitely, but the impulse is the same. The refusal to accept that death is simply nothing. The treatment of the dead binds communities together. The rituals performed at death, the preparation of the body, the gathering of mourners, the ceremonies that mark the passage create solidarity among the living. The dead become ancestors, become part of the community's identity, become links to the past that give the present meaning. The burial practices that emerge from archaeological sites are not just individual responses to individual deaths. They are social practices, shared traditions, communal activities that reinforce bonds among the living while honoring the dead. Death becomes occasion for reaffirming what the community believes and values. The graves we find are the ones that survived dug deep enough or in locations protected enough to preserve the bones and objects they contained. Many more graves were dug and have disappeared, their contents scattered by time and nature. The burials we study are a small sample of a practice that was probably universal, that marked human communities wherever they lived, that expressed the beliefs about death that every culture has developed. The sample is biased, is incomplete, is a fraction of what once existed. But even the fraction reveals something essential about human nature. We do not forget our dead. We mark their passing. We care for their remains. We hope, against all evidence, that they continue somehow, somewhere. We close this chapter standing beside an ancient grave, a body laid carefully in a position that cannot be accidental, surrounded by objects placed by hands that loved or honored the deceased, covered with red ochre that still stains the bones after thousands of years. The burials that proved the dead were not forgotten. The care that extended beyond life's ending. The rituals that made death meaningful rather than merely final. The beliefs that we cannot know but can recognize as human responses to the universal challenge of mortality. The graves, the care, the hope that death is not ending. The ancestors who rest in earth we walk over, who wait in silence for the recognition we give them by remembering. Forever mourned, forever honored, forever testimony to human refusal to accept that the dead are simply gone. Forever. Language is humanity's greatest invention, yet no one invented it. It emerged, somehow, from species that communicated through gesture and call, developing into the symbolic systems that allow these words to convey meaning across distance and time. Language transformed what humans could think, could remember, could share. Before language, there was no history, no accumulated wisdom, no culture in the full sense. After language, everything became possible. The words that created worlds. The sounds that became symbols. The meanings that passed from mind to mind and generation to generation, building the shared reality that makes human life human. The origins of language are shrouded in uncertainty. Language leaves no fossils. We cannot dig up the first words, cannot find preserved the first conversations. We can only infer from anatomy and archaeology and comparison with other species when and how language might have emerged. The theories are numerous and contested. Some argue that language is very old, developing gradually over millions of years. Others argue that it is relatively recent, a sudden emergence perhaps 100,000 years ago or less. The debate cannot be resolved with current evidence. The origins of language remain one of the great unsolved problems of human evolution. The anatomy of speech is informative, if ambiguous. The position of the larynx affects what sounds can be produced. The shape of the tongue and the size of the mouth affect articulation. The bones that preserve skull base, hyoid bone, can be studied for clues about vocal capabilities. Neanderthals appear to have had vocal anatomy compatible with speech, suggesting that they may have had language of some kind. The FOXP2 gene, associated with language capacity in modern humans, was also present in Neanderthals. The anatomical evidence suggests that the potential for language existed in multiple human species, though whether that potential was realized, and to what extent, remains unknown. Gesture may have preceded speech. Apes communicate extensively through gesture, and gesture comes naturally to humans. Even now we gesture while speaking. Gesture to communicate across language barriers. Gesture when words fail. Some theories propose that language began in gesture and only later transferred to the vocal channel. The transfer may have happened because vocalization freed the hands for other tasks, because sound could carry further and work in darkness, because the vocal channel could eventually produce more distinctions than gesture alone. The gesture-first hypothesis remains speculative, but it connects human language to communication systems that existed before any human species evolved. What distinguishes human language from animal communication? Many animals communicate. Birds sing, whales call, bees dance. But human language has properties that seem unique. It is symbolic. Sounds stand for meanings arbitrarily, by convention rather than natural connection. It is productive. We can combine symbols to create novel messages, can say things that have never been said before. It is recursive. Sentences can be embedded within sentences indefinitely, creating infinite possibility from finite means. These properties make human language qualitatively different from other communication systems, not just quantitatively more complex. Language is not continuous with animal calls. It is something new. Language created the possibility of culture in the full sense. Before language, knowledge could be transmitted only through observation and imitation. I watch you make a tool and try to copy what you do. With language, knowledge could be explained. I tell you how to make the tool, what materials to use, what techniques are effective. The difference is enormous. Explanation allows for subtlety, for abstraction, for transmission of knowledge that cannot be observed. Language allowed our ancestors to share not just behaviors but beliefs, not just actions but explanations, not just present experience but memories and plans. The accumulated wisdom of generations could be passed to each new generation through words. The diversity of human languages is remarkable. Perhaps 7,000 languages are spoken today, each with its own sounds, its own grammar, its own way of organizing meaning. The diversity suggests that language is not a single invention, but a capacity that can be realized in many different ways. All human populations have language. All human languages are complex, capable of expressing any thought that humans need to express. There are no primitive languages, no simple languages, no languages that are less capable than others. The universality of language and the diversity of languages suggest that language is both biologically given and culturally shaped, a human capacity that each culture develops in its own way. Language shaped the minds that produced it. The acquisition of language in children involves massive restructuring of the brain. The processing of language engages regions that do not exist in other primates. Language is not just a tool that humans use, it is part of what human cognition is. We think in language. We remember in language. We experience the world through concepts that language provides. The words that created worlds did not just allow communication of pre-existing thoughts, they created new kinds of thoughts, new ways of organizing experience, new possibilities for mind itself. We close this chapter listening for the first word sounds that have vanished into silence, conversations that were never recorded, the emergence of meaning from minds that were learning what meaning could be, the words that created worlds. The gift of language that we inherit from ancestors who discovered it without understanding what they were discovering. The sounds that became symbols. The symbols that became thoughts. The thoughts that became culture. Language is what makes these words possible. What allows this communication across distance? What connects your mind to the mind that composed these sentences? The words, forever speaking, forever creating, forever the foundation of everything human, forever. We close where we began, with the mystery of becoming human. The journey traced through these chapters has covered millions of years, has touched multiple species and countless individuals whose lives we cannot know. We have walked the paths our ancestors walked, have stood where they stood, have tried to imagine what they experienced, even knowing that imagination must fall short. The journey of human becoming is not finished. It did not end when Homo sapiens emerged. It did not end when we spread across the earth. It continues still, in every generation that inherits what came before and adds something new. We are still becoming human. The process is ongoing. The footprints at Litali taught us that bipedalism came first, that our ancestors walked upright before their brains expanded, before they made sophisticated tools, before they controlled fire. The walking made possible everything that followed. The hands freed by walking became hands that shaped stone and created art. The bodies balanced on two legs became bodies that could travel vast distances, colonizing continents, adapting to every environment the earth offered. The footprints are testimony to the first great transformation, the foundation on which everything else was built. The bones whispered secrets across millennia, told us of species that rose and fell, of diversity that once existed and is now gone, of ancestors whose lives we can partially reconstruct, but never fully know. The bones are precious precisely because they are rare, because most of our ancestors left no trace, because the fossil record is a tiny sample of the vast population that lived and died. We work with fragments, build theories on incomplete evidence, acknowledge uncertainty as constant companion. The bones teach humility as well as knowledge. Africa was the cradle, the continent where everything human began, where our lineage evolved across millions of years, where we finally emerged as the species that would inherit the earth. Every human alive carries African ancestry. Every human population traces back to African origins. The migrations that populated the world came from African source populations. Whatever divides us now, whatever categories we create to distinguish human groups, is shallow compared to the African roots we share. We are all children of the cradle, inheritors of the African story. The stones taught hands to think the tools that our ancestors created, requiring intelligence, planning, learning that had to be transmitted across generations. The making of tools shaped the makers, selected for capabilities that would eventually produce the minds we have today. The fire changed what it meant to be alive, extending the day, cooking food, creating social spaces where culture could develop. The wandering carried home within us the capacity to survive wherever we went, to make any place into home through knowledge and skill. The companions who walked beside us are gone now, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the others, but they are not entirely vanished. Their DNA lives on in us, testimony to encounters that produced children, to coexistence that lasted long enough for mixing to occur. The minds that emerged could remember what had not happened, could imagine, could plan, could create possibilities that had never existed. The art that bloomed in darkness testified to the creative capacity that distinguishes human minds, the need to make meaning and beauty and lasting marks. The burials proved the dead were not forgotten, showed that our ancestors faced mortality with ritual and belief, with care that extended beyond life's ending. The words created world's language, transforming what humans could think and share and remember, making culture possible, making history possible, making these words possible that you read or hear now. The journey does not end here. We are still evolving, though the mechanisms have changed. Cultural evolution now outpaces biological evolution, but both continue. We are still wandering, spreading into new territories, adapting to new environments, creating new ways of being human. We are still making tools, though the tools are now digital as well as physical. We are still making art, still burying our dead with care, still creating words that try to capture meaning. The capacities that evolved over millions of years continue to operate, continue to shape what we do and think and feel. The ancestors are present in everything we are. What will our descendants say about us? What will they learn from the traces we leave? They will know things about us that we cannot know ourselves, will see patterns we cannot see, will understand our moment in ways we cannot understand it. We will become ancestors. We will become the past that future generations study and try to reconstruct. The journey that began with footprints in volcanic ash will continue through us to whatever comes after. We are link in a chain that stretches back millions of years and forward into futures we cannot imagine. Sleep now. Dream of the long human journey of ancestors who walked before memory, who shaped stone and tamed fire, who buried their dead and painted in caves, who spoke the first words and asked the first questions. Dream of the companions who walked beside us and vanished. Dream of the African cradle where everything began. Dream of the wandering that carried humanity across the earth. Dream of the art and the burials and the language, of everything that makes us human, of the capacities that evolved over millions of years and live on in you. The journey that never ends continues through you. You carry the ancestors within you in your DNA, in your bones, in the shape of your brain and the capacity of your mind. You are the latest chapter in a story that began long before you and will continue long after. The fire still burns. The words still create worlds. The art still blooms. The dead are still remembered. The journey continues, forever unfinished, forever becoming, Forever the mystery of what it means to be human. The journey, forever. The becoming, forever. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of its brief presence in the vast becoming, carrying the past into the future, link in the chain that connects what was to what will be, the journey that never ends, forever. Good night.